There's a specific moment most men, and there's probably a lot of women that feel the same way, or at least they may not talk to a man. They may actually share more with other women. But let me just speak to the idea that I started out with about something that men never talk about. Not the moment when something goes wrong, that one gets told at the bar in a truck or maybe eventually to a therapist, but I mean the moment before that, the moment when you're alone, usually late at night, something in you goes completely quiet. And in that quiet, you realize you don't know who's living inside your own body. You know the exterior, you know the game you're playing. You can account for every decision that brought you perhaps into this room, this life, the face that you see in the mirror. But the thing doing the looking, that thing feels like a stranger in a suit, perhaps that it didn't choose. The feeling is not a syndrome or a symptom. The feeling is what it is. You might even call it data. And if you've been running from it, well, it just found a new you, and it's okay. I'm Mark Roach. This is Transcendent. Across decades in the oil and gas business, athletics, art, and the long interior work that most people never experience, especially in these arenas where people operate functionally, but rarely share or talk about or even find the language or the courage just to make a hollow sound from that place. But my life circumstances have led me to question everything, to look deeper into my own beliefs and those that others say are their beliefs. So I wrote a novel and a screenplay called Meat Suit. It's not a title that was meant to shock anybody, but as the most honest phrase or descriptor I could find for what all of us are really navigating to some degree, depending on how aware you are or not. And it's okay not to be. In fact, it may be a lot easier on yourself and everybody else if you're not. But some of us really don't have a choice. And that gap between the person you actually are and the body, the role, and the performance the world handed you and called your life. That's the gap I often talk about. Today, I want to explore that. Something that I believe is one of the most urgent and unfortunately least discussed question of this moment, not just in literature, but in culture and in men's health, in the way that we understand identity at all. So by the end of this video, if it is even possible for someone to watch a video and be more aware or transformed or in tune with who you really are, we'll try. But I hope that you at least you begin to understand three things. First, why the question of who lives inside the body is not a philosophical, entertainment, but a genuine survival question for millions of people right now. And then secondly, what late night journals reveal that nothing else can reveal to you. And third, why the characters watching from the sidelines, the ones who see everything and are never quite asked, might just be the most important characters in your own story. And there's one piece of this that changes everything, something about who needs this work the most and why they're the last to pick it up. I'll come back to that. But first, let me show you where we are. Well, the data is not subtle. Globally, men die by suicide nearly twice the rate of women, and in the United States, that number reaches 4 times. 67% of men report that they feel that they must hide their emotions to be considered real men. 40% of men have never spoken to anyone about their mental health, not a friend, not a therapist, not a partner, not once. And what is happening on social media right now in 2026 reflects exactly this. The phrase, men are struggling mentally, is trending. Searches for I have no friends have nearly doubled from their baseline last spring. The Google query, how to make friends, hits its highest recorded interest in early March of this year. This is not a generation of broken men. This is a generation of men who were handed a suit that may just not fit this old paradigm that's told to perform wearing it and given no language for the friction. Well, Meat Suit begins with a dream. A man wakes in his house in Katy, Texas, practical, competent, an oil and gas engineer with a teenager, a mortgage, and opinions about barbecue. And he can't shake the dream. A woman named Sofia in a destroyed dining room, the chandelier swinging, broken china, and a knife, a silver apple, a look on her face that is simultaneously desire and grief and absolute clarity. He files it on the shelf. He makes coffee. He puts on his tie, and then in a car and on his way to a meeting, it comes back. Because the dreams that arrive with transmission quality, not invented but received, those dreams do not stay where you try to put them. So what made me write this book, the screenplay, is the same thing making culture move right now. In 2026, one of the defining consumer and cultural trends tracked by trend forecasters across fashion, advertising, and behavior is what researchers are calling somatic intelligence. The body as the new authority. As artificial intelligence masters language and emotional mimicry, the human body is regaining value precisely because it resists optimization. Truth is no longer sought in what is said, but what is felt. Body reacts before the rational mind intervenes. It remembers through sensation rather than narrative. The man in Meat Suit is living this before anyone named it. He is trying to be a practical man in a world that keeps delivering experiences that the practical frameworks cannot hold. So let me start with what the journals actually are. Not what journals are supposed to be. Not the morning pages routine. Not the gratitude list. Not the self-help apparatus. I mean the real ones. The 3 in the morning ones, when social management systems have gone offline and the comfortable interpretations have stopped reasserting themselves. The journal that has nowhere to be presented and no audience to perform for. Those journals are the most accurate document of a life that most people produce, and they are the most dangerous. In Meat Suit, the protagonist late-night journals are the hinge of the entire story. They contain the darkest material, the overflow from the nights when the pressure had no other outlet, the desires he was ashamed of, not just their objects, but their quality, the rages he managed to keep inside the skull, the memories he had been trying to metabolize for decades. And when someone who loves him reads those journals without permission, when she prints them, puts them in a folder, and sits across from him in a counselor's office, something ruptures that no amount of honest conversation could have prevented, because she had accessed the private architecture. She found the midnight version of a man and made decisions about that version alone. The midnight version was real. He never argues otherwise. But a person is not their worst hours any more than they are their best. The journal is not the man. It is the record of everything the man could carry or couldn't carry in daylight. Stay with me, because this is where it becomes something other than a story about one man in Texas. Privacy in this book is not about hiding. It is something structural. The inner life requires a space where it exists without justifying its existence to anyone else, where it can be contradictory and unfinished, violent and tender in the same entry, ugly and searching in the same paragraph, without triggering someone else's management of their reaction to it. You can be, by every external measure, a person of extraordinary transparency. And still there must be a drawer, a lock you actually engage, not because you're ashamed, because the self is not a public building. Here's what a lot of people miss about this. The journals contain everything the man could not say out loud. They're not concealment. They are gestation, work in progress. The problem is not that he kept them private. The problem is that he kept them private because he didn't believe anyone could receive what was in them without flinching. And the tragedy of that belief is that it kept him from offering the one thing that would have changed the relationship, the invitation to know him as he actually was, not the managed version, not the competent oil and gas engineer with the clean kitchen and the organized notebooks, the version that sat on the floor of his own ruined dining room and took honest inventory of what it had cost to be this particular person. When Frank, his closest friend, was dying, and Frank was dying in the specific measured accountant's way that Frank did everything, they sat on a porch on a February morning in the light, and the protagonist confessed, not to a therapist, not to the woman he'd loved, to the man who had known him in the full operational version of his life, the man who could see the structure beneath the surface. And Frank said something I have been thinking about ever since. I'm not holding it. I'm witnessing it being held. These are fundamentally different acts. When you needed, or what you needed, wasn't to transfer this to someone else. You needed it to exist in the air between two people in the shared air for the first time. That changes the physics of it. Being witnessed is not the same as being managed. Being managed is being handed a container for the thing you brought and told how it works. Being witnessed is being seen, holding the thing, the actual thing in all its weight and ugliness and specificity by someone who doesn't flinch and doesn't offer you a better container. It is, when done well, one of the most difficult and most generous acts a person can perform. The problem is that most men never have experienced it. They've been managed by therapists, managed by the institutional vocabulary of healing, managed by well-meaning people who loved them in the only way they knew how, which was to try to fix what they could see. But witnessing, that requires someone who can be still without preparing a response. Now let me tell you about Cap and Sav, the meat suit. In the meat suit, there are two figures who observe everything. They exist outside of the timeline. They play checkers on a card table in a moonlit field, a field that's always been there, always moonlit. Grass the color of a place that has never known drought. They are not quite people, or rather, maybe they were once people, or maybe they will be, or could be, depending on your angle. And they've been watching this particular life, this particular man in his particular meat suit, with the specific attention of those who understand what is actually at stake. They see the full arc. They know about the dream and the journals and Frank dying and the girls praying in the back of the Suburban and the tire in the ditch. And they speak about it with a kind of careful precision that only comes from permanent, patient observation. The suits break down. Cap says, they always do. That's the point. And the reason those figures matter, the reason they're not a gimmick but a necessary architecture, is that they represent something every person watching this already knows but rarely admits. Some part of us is watching our own life from the outside. Some part of us observes the choices being made by the person who is supposed to be us. The suit we're wearing, the performance of being alive, the registers of the gap between what's happening and what is actually true. Most of us silence that observer. We call it overthinking. We tell it to go back to sleep. Meat suit is an argument that the observer is the most important intelligence in the room. Not because the observer has the answers, but because the observer has the honest questions. Here's the part that changes everything. This is a specific demographic that is most naturally drawn to this work. Men and women in their 30s through 50s who have been high functioning for long enough to start feeling the specific exhaustion of someone who has been performing competence while something much more important was being left unaddressed. Professionals, oil and gas people, finance people, athletes who pivoted, people who built things, people who, by every external metric, are succeeding, and who, late at night, writing in a notebook or staring at a ceiling, know that success is not the same as being alive. And there is a second group that needs this work, needs it most, but is the most resistant to it. Men in their 20s and 30s who are right now absorbing the message that identity is performance, that value is output, that the body is a vehicle for achievement rather than a home. The data on male mental health in 2026 is explicit. 44% of men believe they should simply deal with it themselves. 37% believe seeking help makes them seem less of a man. These are men who have been handed a suit that doesn't fit and are told the discomfort is their fault. They won't pick up a book called Meat Suit because the title itself is a challenge to their performance. It names the thing that they've been trained not to name. It says, "You're not the suit." And that sentence, for a man who has built his entire identity on wearing the suit correctly, is not an invitation. It is a threat. But here is what those men actually need to hear and what I wrote this book to say. The question of what lives inside the body is not weakness. It is the most serious inquiry available to a person. The man in this novel is a practical man, an engineer, a businessman, a father, and he's not asking these questions from a position of defeat. He's asking them from a position of accumulated evidence. The riptide that almost took him, the girls praying in the Suburban when the tire went flat and the stranger appeared with the exact replacement and refused payment and disappeared into a countryside where nobody had ever heard of him. Frank dying in the morning light on the porch, and the quiet that remained after everything optional had been removed. The body breaks down. That is not a failure of the system. That is the system. What is inside, while it is whole, what it managed to carry, what it was able to deliver before the delivery is interrupted, that is the question worth asking. This channel began as a resource for people navigating complex PTSD. But Transcendent is for everyone, anyone human who faces pain or transformation at various points in life. Sometimes the pain is obvious, sometimes it's unseen until the very end. What matters is the journey away from the outdated patterns toward a spirit that cannot be duplicated by artificial intelligence or healed through force or manipulated with a plan. That's what Meat Suit explores, not the performance of transformation, not the managed presentation of healing, the actual thing. The man on the floor of his own making, taking inventory in the most honest place in any room. If this resonates and you want to go deeper, you can find my work and more than 20 books, including Meat Suit, at roachcreative.com. I am Mark Roach, and this is Transcendent, wishing you all and always the best. The most dangerous thing in any room is the honest question nobody's willing to ask. But the most generous thing one person can do for another is to ask it anyway and stay